You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Today, Jeanie joins us again to tell the second part of her story. In part one, she helped us to understand the dynamics she was facing in her marriage and the process of seeking help from 4 different counselors and finally finding some clarity and a way forward. If you haven't already listened to that episode, please do go back and do that before starting part 2, because that background will be helpful in following what Jeanie will share today. Again, we will be discussing topics of sexual abuse and marital rape, so please be mindful of little ears as you listen. In order to help you understand and follow some of the elements of today's story, I want to give you a mini lesson on a few aspects of the BCO, the Book of Church Order, a governing document of the PCA. First of all, the BCO is very clear that church sessions do not have the authority to censure someone, such as barring them from the Lord's Supper, without either a trial or a written confession replacing a trial. A trial would include opportunities for the accused person to present their own evidence and witnesses in their defense. And the BCO states unequivocally that a person agreeing to allow a written confession to replace a trial must be fully aware that this is what is taking place and voluntarily consent to this process. Another important fact to keep in mind is what the BCO says about suspension from the Lord's Supper. If a person is found guilty during a trial or by virtue of their own confession, one possible censure is what is called indefinite suspension. The term indefinite just means that there is no predetermined time for the suspension. And there is an important reason for this. Suspension from the Lord's Supper is not a slap on the wrist or a penalty, like having your driver's license suspended for a predetermined amount of time. Suspending someone from the Lord's table is something that a session should only do if they were concerned that the person might be taking communion with a hardened and unrepentant heart, and therefore placing themselves in serious spiritual danger. This means that the session cannot set a time limit in advance because the person could confess and show evidence of repentance in a shorter period of time, or continue to be hardened and unrepentant even after that predetermined time limit ends. For this reason, there is no such thing as definite suspension or suspension from the Lord's table for a specific predetermined amount of time as a censure in the Book of Church Order. I know this is a lot of technical information to take in, but hopefully it will help you to understand some of the problematic aspects of what Jeanie experienced in her church. And if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject of church discipline in the PCA and as outlined in the BCO, we'll share more information at the end of the podcast about where to find our free online courses. Before I ask Jeanie to tell you about what happened next, I want to play a clip of something she shared at the end of the last episode. These were words that Richard said to her, and they are an important backdrop for everything that unfolds going forward.
And finally, in desperation, I said, "Can you please just let me go?" And he looked at me and he said, "Hell no. And if you try to leave, I'm going to go to the children and I'm going to tell them, I love them and I love you, but mommy is making me leave. She's destroying our family and making me leave.
So after that really difficult conversation that you had with Richard that went well into the night, you knew that you needed to reach out for some help from the church. And so you called your senior pastor, Andy, to share what was going on. Tell me a little bit about how that went.
Yeah. So after that night, because Richard had made the comment that he did about that if I tried to leave, that he would go to the children and he would tell them, that he loved me and loved them, but that I was destroying the family and making them leave. That sent so much fear through me, because one of the things I cared about more than anything else was my children's good opinion of me. So I felt completely trapped. I felt like I wasn't going to be able to leave. And that essentially I was like a whipped dog in the relationship. I just had to go along to get along. And I felt like a slave, essentially. Like I really didn't have any say or agency, which, I mean, I think goes to saying patriarchy has a way of making you feel like you don't have agency, even though you're a grown adult. And other people would look at this situation from the outside and just say, just go ahead and file for divorce, like they don't understand. But in that moment, like it's the same thing with the sex. I didn't say no because I didn't feel like I was allowed to say no. And so now I'm not leaving because I don't feel like I'm allowed to leave. And I was desperate. So I called the pastor because I thought maybe he could call Richard and explain to him, you really should cooperate. You should go to the mediator. Like I thought he could get that happening. And I explained to him the situation, and he kind of said, well, we have a process, when people come to us that want to get divorced. And he said that he wanted to form a commission. I think he called it a commission. And that there would be women allowed on the commission. And that I would have to attend counseling. He didn't say with who, I had told him at this point that I had been to a number of counselors on my own and that Richard had refused to go. So he said I'd have to attend counseling, and that basically the church would agree with whatever this commission decided. If the commission decided that I could divorce, then I would be allowed to divorce. And if they decided against it, I would not be allowed to. So I sat on this for a couple of weeks, and I started to realize that, even though I thought that, the pastor was sympathetic and I thought, maybe they would rule in my favor, there were a lot of things that I could see it going the other way. Namely that my spouse still wanted to save the marriage. And I tend to see in church circles that if even one of the spouses is saying, I still want to save the marriage, they kind of push towards saving the marriage, even if it's not a healthy situation. And I don't believe he even would have done anything. It's just what he says, because that's the pattern of our relationship, is he says one thing and he does another. So I decided that rather than go through this whole issue with the commission and this counseling, which could probably last for several more months at least, and may even end up that they tell me I have to stay married. And then I'm, during all this time, living in this situation where I'm feeling trapped, I'm feeling under duress, he's refusing to move out, that it was better for me to just say, look, I appreciate that, but I'm just going to proceed with the divorce, and so I went back to Andy and I said, thank you very much, but I'm going to get divorced. And after that, I started looking to hire a mediator. Because, I think you don't want to get lawyers involved from a Christian perspective because you're told to stay out of the courts. So I started looking for a mediator that might be able to settle the divorce.
And after one of these phone calls that you had with Andy, was it maybe the first phone call you had with him that you decided you wanted to sit down and put into writing everything that you talked to him about on the phone?
Yeah, I did that the same day as the first phone call. Basically, I had the phone call with him, and then that very evening sent everything I had told him in the phone call over email so that I had a written documentation of what we discussed.
And one of the things that you had mentioned earlier was that, every time you had talked to somebody, whether it be a friend or, an elder's wife or even your earlier marriage counselors, you were kind of general in your expression of things, just, oh yeah, sex isn't very enjoyable. And that hadn't made a lot of progress for you because people were just hearing that as like, oh, right, everyone goes through that. Every marriage has that kind of problem. And so both when you talked to Andy on the phone and then also the letter that you wrote, you were intentionally being very direct and explicit, not in an inappropriate way, but very explicit, like to make sure there's no confusion here. This isn't just your run of the mill, oh, right, every marriage, your sex life has its ups and downs. And you want it to be very clear. And you've given us permission to share a portion of that letter. And the reason we're sharing this is because we just want to illustrate this is what the session had in hand in writing, or at least we'll get to that part in a minute. At least this is what your senior pastor had in hand in writing. So I'm going to read a portion of this. And there is, this is a lengthy letter. It's very detailed. We're not reading the whole thing, not because there's anything inappropriate about what you shared, but because it is pretty heavy and it's pretty serious stuff. So we're gonna read a portion just to give a clear picture of what you shared. But again, the letter was important that you be very, very frank and direct so that there wouldn't be any misunderstanding. So these are two different paragraphs from your letter. You said, so this is what sex with my husband became like. I would enter the dark room and get under the covers. I would remove my pants and lay face down on the bed, often with a pillow over my head so I wouldn't have to look at him. He would come in and you described him engaging in this one-sided sex while I tried to think of anything else, mentally be anywhere else until it was over. Sometimes I would cry under the pillow, but I tried not to let him know so it wouldn't ruin the experience for him. Sometimes I would want to hit him, but I would stifle it by gripping the sheets tightly. When he was finished, he would go to the bathroom while I quickly got dressed and left the room before he returned. I would go downstairs to the other bathroom and rinse off, partly because I felt dirty and partly just because I couldn't face him at that moment and needed some time to pass. Looking back, I have no idea how I did this for about a decade. I eventually did tell him during that time that I couldn't handle it more than once a week, but he would ask like clockwork every week, and that whole day I would be anxious and shorter with the children. The only thing I liked about sex days was it meant I had 6 whole days before it would happen again. And then later on in the letter you shared, on January 3rd, 2021, it all came to a head. I was waking up one morning and started to feel vibes coming from his side of the bed. I decided that I would try to just get up and go downstairs very quickly before he could try anything. But when I jumped up, he grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the bed and started kissing me. I thought he may just kiss me and let me go, so I tried to, quote, grin and bear it at first.
But then he started trying to get on top of me. And at that point, I realized he was naked. My body went into fight or flight, and I shoved him off me with all the strength I could muster. And I yelled, "No," and started crying. He immediately got up, got dressed, and left the room. I took a few moments to collect myself and then headed downstairs to talk to him, but discovered that he had taken the car and left the house. He came back 3 hours later, and we did talk then. He said he would not continue to stay in a sexless marriage. He even said the marriage had been sexless for over 10 years, which was incredibly hurtful to me because I had endured a lot emotionally, physically, and mentally to keep the sex on at very high personal cost. He basically gave me a 1-year ultimatum to start liking sex or he would leave. He was specific that he didn't want to go back to the old ways. He wanted me to actually enjoy it, which felt completely impossible for me to control under the circumstances of having the gun to my head that he was going to leave if it wasn't fixed in a year.
Mhm.
That's, again, it's heavy. It's a lot to read. But it was right for you to be very open and honest with your pastor and with your session about what was going on. And when you shared that letter with Andy, what did you tell him about sharing that with the rest of the session or with other people?
I think it was one of the first lines of the letter. I told him that I gave him blanket permission to share it with anybody that he thought needed to see it in order for them to make an informed decision.
And do you believe that Andy did he share that letter with the other session members?
To my knowledge, he didn't share that letter with anyone. He told me at one point that he had summarized or paraphrased some of it to share with some of the other pastors. I'm not even 100% sure that all of the elders were aware of the letter. It sounds to me, at least, that he may have only shared even a summary of it with the people who were teaching elders on staff. So I think a lot of the, just the regular elders that were within the congregation, I think there's a good chance that they weren't even aware of it. And like I said, even the ones that were aware of it, he said he just, kind of gave them a few summaries about it, different parts of it.
Yeah. So that had a pretty big impact on you when Andy told you that he had summarized. Why was that?
Yeah. He had told me that the letter had made him uncomfortable. And so I was pretty sure that when he was summarizing it for others, he was also sanitizing it for others. And when I was going to the counselors and I was kind of sanitizing my own story, they weren't picking up that there was any abuse present. And they weren't picking up that there was anything out of the ordinary with our marriage problems. And so if he's only summarizing it, if he's not letting them read what's there, then I didn't see how are they really making an informed choice about what's happening in my marriage.
And around this time, pretty soon after you shared this verbally over the phone and then an email with Andy, you also shared a book with his wife. Tell me about that.
Yeah. I had read The Great Sex Rescue by Sheila Gregoire. And team. She has. And it had been really impactful, on me. And there were many instances throughout the book that really were, it was very reminiscent of what I was experiencing in my marriage. So Andy's wife had in the past given me books about marriage. So I thought, wow, maybe I can give her one. And I gave her a copy. And in this particular copy, I actually had underlined certain parts, because I felt like maybe if she's going through this and she sees like, oh, this is a part that resonated, it might help her make that connection of what's happening. And so she accepted it graciously. And the very next week, I, went up to her after the service and I asked her if she had started reading it. And she was like, yes, it's fascinating. It's just fascinating. And I was feeling very encouraged. But then later on down the line, I saw her again and asked her if she had ever finished the book. And then she said, well, I didn't really agree with her about everything, and all of a sudden the tone changed. And I got the impression that once she started coming up in things that she didn't fully agree with, she just stopped reading. So I don't know if she ever saw any of my notes or any of the things that resonated with me.
You described that after you talked to Andy on the phone that first time, his recommendation was that he form a commission and that this commission would then decide whether you could divorce or not. And you thought about that for a few weeks. You decided you needed to move forward with mediation. And so you did actually start mediation with Richard, but then at a certain point, he stopped attending mediation. What happened there?
Yeah, we had a mediation meeting, and during the mediation, we hammered out a full agreement. Like we agreed on every point. The mediator sent us like a draft to review. And a few weeks went by and Richard hadn't said anything, hadn't approved the draft. And so I finally reached out to him via text and I'm like, I'm good to approve the draft as is, kind of like, can we proceed? And he texted me back and said, basically that he had considered it and that getting divorced is not in his best interest. So he will not be attending any more mediations. He will not be signing anything and he will not be moving out of the house. And it was like those 3 points. Boom, boom, boom. I will not be signing anything, will not be attending any more mediations, and I won't be moving out of the house. So that was another moment where I just felt trapped. Like, okay, he's making it impossible for me to divorce then.
And at this point, Richard actually reached out to Andy or to the session?
He actually reached out to them before the mediation meeting. And he had used that to try to stall the mediation. So I had the mediation scheduled. He reached out to Andy and he told Andy that he wanted the session to rule on the biblicalness of our divorce. And he came back to me and was like, he made it sound like it was Andy's idea, but Andy said it was Richard's idea. And he said that, the church wants to weigh in on our divorce. And I think we owe it to them. I think we, I think he kind of said something like that. And I said, I've had some conversations with them. And I said, I feel like I already know what their heart is. So I want, to proceed with mediation. And at that point, he did go to mediation. And then very close thereafter. So there's like there's probably like a lag of maybe a week between us going to mediation and then the session ruling against me and censuring me. So then by the time we get the paperwork from the mediator, and now I'm getting this text saying that he's not going to do mediation anymore. The session has ruled against me during that few weeks between the mediation and this.
So tell me about that phone call. There was a session meeting, and then Andy called you after that session meeting. Tell me about that phone call.
Right. Yeah. He called me and he told me that the session had met and that they had decided that I was going to be banned from the Lord's table for 6 months and that I had to step down from the worship team for 6 months. But that kind of like after that, after 6 months, that's it. Everything goes back to the way it is now. You know, you're in good standing after the 6 months, and, you know, we love you, and that's that. And I started crying tears of joy as he was telling me, because I truly thought they would look at it and say that Jeanie is pursuing a divorce, and, you know, she hasn't gotten our permission, so she's in willful sin. So therefore, we are going to put her under discipline. Oh, look, she's still pursuing the divorce. She's in unrepentant sin, and eventually that I would be excommunicated for continuing to pursue the divorce unrepentantly. So, so when they told me it was just going to be 6 months and then I was going to be like fully restored, it almost was like they were being so generous. Thank you so much, because I was like, wow, I can get restored. I didn't think I was going to be able to get restored. I thought it was going to just be all the way to excommunication and, and then I'm damned.
So just to clarify, especially for anybody who might be listening who is somewhat familiar with the PCA process in the Book of Church Order, did you ever receive a letter or anything that laid out what the charges were that were being brought against you?
No. And that's to this day a little like at the time, I definitely thought I was being disciplined for getting divorced or for pursuing divorce because I hadn't actually filed. But as time has gone on and things have been transpired at this point, and like I said, I can't speak for certain because I still have never received anything in writing or a straight answer from the church. At this point, I think I was actually disciplined for refusing to follow their prescription of going to counseling and getting the commission and going through the commission process. So yeah, because and that jives more with some of the other things I've heard from Andy as time has gone on. So I think that was what I was actually disciplined for. But like I said, to this day, I still don't really know for sure.
So no clear statement of charges.
Nope.
No details about, ways in which you committed those sins that you were being charged for. And also, just to be clear, was there ever any sort of trial? Were you ever, brought in to answer questions, allowed to have any other witnesses?
No, they never even asked me.
And did you at any point sign anything saying, yes, I'm confessing to having committed these specific sins?
No.
So you get off the phone. At that point, considering what you were fearing, you're actually thinking like, wow, this is so nice of them to only suspend me from the Lord's Supper for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what happened, in those following months. What did you do?
Well, okay. So then during my suspension from the Lord's table, I just started to, I was still listening to podcasts. I was still reading, and I, started to question things. I started to be like, wow, like, would this have come out the same way if if there had been women involved, is part of this that the men on the session can empathize more with my husband not having, a enthusiastic sex partner than they can empathize with what it was for me to be essentially abandoned in the marriage and being forced to engage against my will. And so there was that. I definitely felt like being a woman, I may have been treated differently. And so once my time was up, Andy had offered to go out to lunch with me and kind of do like a post-mortem where I could ask questions or things like that. And his wife came along. And so I had asked him, I said, well, why didn't they, discipline Richard also? Or why was it foregone conclusion that I needed discipline? How come, you didn't just say, we don't want to rule on this. We abstain, and just stay out of it. Like I was, because what had ended up happening was, as we had discussed before, then when Richard refused to go back to the mediator and was telling me he wasn't going to sign anything, he wasn't going to move out, I went to Andy and I showed him the texts and I said, can you just call him? Because I thought if Andy called him and said, you really do, you shouldn't be holding her hostage. You really should go back to mediation. I thought if he started talking to him like that, man to man, there was a good chance he could get him to relent. But at that point, Andy told me, like, the session's already ruled against you. You've tied my hands. You've tied our hands. We, kind of like, we can't help you anymore. And I told him at that lunch, I said, you empowered Richard. Richard is telling people that the church sided with him, and it was kind of like this, oh, well, kind of, yeah, sorry, that's tough, like that kind of an attitude. Like, yeah, that's tough. And at one point I kind of said, like, I don't understand why you had to rule. And he said something like, once Richard had made a complaint that the session was activated and that they had to rule. And I mean, I just took his word for that at the time. I was like, okay, they had to rule. But it did at the same time. Like, I remember going home and thinking, like, wow, what is this? Is this like, the volcano god that it like demands a sacrifice? Yeah, it's like, why am I kind of like the sacrificial offering here that must be sacrificed upon the altar of the session? I don't know. It felt very much like that. Like the session must be appeased. And looking back on it now, what I think, and I don't know that Andy was this person. I think there's a very good chance it was someone else on the session. But I get the impression that someone needed their pound of flesh. Like somebody felt like they couldn't just let me off. And so that person or people, could be more than one, had to be appeased. And that was the agreement that they came to was, well, we'll just give her 6 months. And that was apparently enough to make that person be like, okay, fine. And that's what I think happened.
And during your time of suspension from the Lord's table, did you continue attending church?
Yes. I wanted to be restored. That was important to me. So I kept attending church and just thought like that was the right thing to do, to be humble and accept my punishment. And so that's what I did. I followed the rules that they gave me. And I I ended up leaving not long after they restored me.
So your suspension was lifted, and that was fall of 2022.
Yeah, the suspension was lifted September 1st of 2022.
No, and at that lunch with Andy, how did he describe how you ought to feel coming back to church after your suspension was lifted?
Oh, he said, come in with your head held high. I remember he said, come in with your head held high. He's like, we love you, like we're, like kind of like we're here for you. We're on, and that was, I came in the next Sunday and I tried to do just that, but it just wasn't the same. I felt like a cautionary tale.
And then when was your divorce finalized?
It was finalized on February the 8th of 2023. Yeah, and I actually didn't even file for divorce until after I was already restored. So I was already restored when I actually filed the paperwork.
So in looking back over this part of your story, especially as it relates to your interactions with the church and the leadership of the church, what do you wish that you had known at the time? What do you wish other people would know or understand about this your experience of the PCA process?
Well, I think I didn't there's so much. I don't think I realized how political the process is. I think in my mind, I just thought, these are our shepherds. These are people who love us and are watching over us, and that, they want what's best for you. They want to love you. I had church was my safe place. I didn't feel threatened by them in any way. And it just, the experience made me feel like it all came down to appeasing, or rather than actually what is right. What would Jesus do in this situation? How would Christ have wanted his church to operate in this situation? And instead, it's all about, making sure this pastor isn't worried that the church is going woke, or, making sure that we, quote unquote, uphold the sanctity of marriage, without an idea that upholding the sanctity of marriage has just as much to do with letting disruptive marriages die as it does with, promoting healthy marriage. And so, yeah, and I would want other lay people, well, first of all, I just want them to know that what the church says about your relationship with Jesus has no bearing on your actual relationship with Jesus. So if you find yourself in a situation like mine, like, I don't want anyone to feel like they are walking away from Jesus if they disagree with a church ruling. I also have learned that, I've gotten a crash course in the Book of Church Order and what the BCO says. You do have rights. So, read the BCO, familiarize yourself. But at the same time, the system is kind of rigged against you because they know the rules already, and they know how it works and you don't. And I think that elders need to appreciate that. First and foremost, they're shepherds. And as shepherds, they need to recognize where their sheep are disadvantaged and advocate for them. I mean, I should have had a pastor assigned to me to help me through this process. And instead, I kind of felt like I was just twisting in the wind.
So if you could have your heart's desire and the church leadership could realize or learn in hindsight from your situation, what do you wish that they could learn or understand?
Number one, they need to appreciate that when someone comes to them with an allegation of any kind of abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, that priority number one needs to be safety. And there needs to be some training and recognition that the person who is coming to them is probably painting the situation in a better light than it actually is. So I would have had such a different experience if one of the pastors would have gone to my husband and said, while this process, comes about, why don't you go stay with your parents for a little while? Because it would have taken the immediate fear. Like, I was afraid in my body. I was not feeling emotionally safe in my house. And because of that, it disadvantaged me as I went through the divorce, because I was willing to agree to almost anything just to get that feeling of safety, to finish things so that he would move out and I didn't have that feeling of intimidation 24 hours a day. So yeah, safety needs to be priority one. And like I said, recognizing that this person may not be the best narrator of how safe they are. They're going to put things in a better light than they are. And also recognizing that if you are in a complementarian culture, that the women are at a disadvantage. So often you come into counseling and they want to do this 50-50 thing. They want to be like, well, this is your part that you've done wrong, and this is your part that you've done wrong. So you do this, and, we'll come back together. But, if the woman is always in a position of having to submit, it's not an equal situation. If she's the one that has to submit to him, then she needs an advocate in therapy. She needs someone to speak for her. And that just, that's an important part of, the patriarchal culture that is the PCA. I think a lot of times there are good men in the PCA, and that the good men cannot imagine ever, treating your wife badly. The good men can't. And so then they project those good intentions onto all men in the PCA instead of recognizing that there are men that's going to use that to their advantage.
And finally, even in this time where there were places you looked for help and didn't find it, there were some places where you found help. Who were some of the helpers that supported you during this time?
Most of my helpers were online. Sheila Gregoire was really helpful. You were, Lena. And my therapist. And yeah, just certain friends that stuck with me and, were there just to listen to me vent.
Jeanie, thank you so much for being willing to tell your story and to help us see from your perspective what it was like to experience the process of church discipline, especially without the benefit of understanding what should have happened and what rights should have been yours according to the BCO. Jeanie's story also raises a question about the role of the church in granting permission for divorce. Does the session have a right to censure someone for not following their advice? The SJC the Standing Judicial Commission, the PCA's highest court, said no in their decision on SJC Case 2019-6. Here is an excerpt from that decision. First, the SJC summarizes this case. This case arose from a July 18, 2016 arraignment at which a member, hereinafter referred to as the petitioner, of Pear Orchard PCA Church in Ridgeland, Mississippi, pled not guilty to the charge of, quote, failing to submit to the government and discipline of the church. She had filed for divorce even though the session had previously communicated to her its conclusion that she did not have biblical grounds for divorce. The SJC ruled that both the session, which is the church's elders, and the presbytery, which is the regional body of elders who upheld the decision of the session, erred in those decisions. And the SJC's rationale for this decision was as follows. Presbytery's answer concludes with the assertion below, which indicates that presbytery and perhaps the session believed the petitioner had only two options: obey and stop the divorce, or file a complaint. But there is at least one other option: to consider, but respectfully disagree, with the session's conclusion. That would not, in itself, be a violation of Membership Vow 5 or de facto evidence of, quote, failing to submit to the government and discipline of the church. Granted, in a situation like that, a session might allege the person is divorcing without biblical grounds and indict on those grounds, but that was not the indictment against the petitioner. So the rationale states that while the session was wrong to indict the petitioner for failing to, quote, submit to the government and discipline of the church, it is possible that they could still have indicted her for what they viewed as an unbiblical divorce. And perhaps that seems like a meaningless distinction. But here are two reasons why it's important. So first of all, this SJC decision makes it clear that the membership vow to, quote, submit to the government and discipline of the church does not require church members to, quote unquote, obey matters of advice from the session. And secondly, should the person actually be charged with unbiblical divorce, she would have the right at trial to present evidence and witnesses against that charge. In other words, she could bring in witnesses that would support her assertion that she had biblical grounds for divorce. If she was being charged with not obeying the advice of the elders, however, evidence about the state of her marriage would not have been relevant to that charge. Again, I know that's a lot of technical language to take in just by listening, so I will put a link to the full case report in the show notes. And my hope by sharing this here is mainly just to make you aware that this case exists and to summarize one aspect of the decision that has implications for other people in PCA churches. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.